Hello everyone, I am your host Bert Liu, and welcome to the episode 2 of the individual series of the Inlua Hill podcast. In today's episode, we are going to explore a surprisingly seldom covered topic, Vietnamese immigration to the United States of America. I will cover the immigration story of the sixth largest immigrant population in the U.S. in 4 sections. First, I will discuss the 3 distinct waves of Vietnamese immigration to the U.S., and for each one elaborate on the push and pull factors and immigration laws that cause Vietnamese immigrants to come to America. Then I will describe how Vietnamese immigrants have been relatively privileged with respect to their immigration to the U.S., and dive into the hardships that Vietnamese Americans experience and how they demonstrated resiliency and activism. Next, I will touch on the stereotypes that Vietnamese Americans are subject to, as well as contributions made by Vietnamese Americans to American culture. Lastly, I will detail the story of a Vietnamese immigrant's journey to the U.S., how that story connects to the greater narrative of Vietnamese immigration, and my own personal thoughts on Vietnamese immigration. First, let's go into the waves of immigration and immigration laws. The history of Vietnamese immigration to the United States is divided into the form of 3 waves. The first wave of immigration began in earnest near the end of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, a war between the communist North Vietnam and the anti-communist South Vietnam, which was heavily supported by the U.S., culminated in the withdrawal of U.S. forces from South Vietnam and the unification of Vietnam under the communist North. When the U.S. began to withdraw, between 125,000 and 130,000 Vietnamese refugees came with them. According to the Migration Policy Institute, quote, these refugees were mainly military personnel and urban educated professionals whose association with the U.S. military or the South Vietnam government made them targets of communist forces, end quote. The main factor pushing this first wave of Vietnamese immigrants to the U.S. was the fear of persecution by the new government of Vietnam for their involvement with the U.S. forces in the war. To allow for the immigration of these Vietnamese refugees, the Indochina Migration and Refugee Act was passed, which, quote, granted the refugees special status to enter the country and established a domestic resettlement program, end quote. These Vietnamese were soon granted permanent residence. They mainly settled in the states of California and Texas, these first wave immigrants. The second wave of immigration were Vietnamese refugees who came during the late 1970s and early 1980s. The initial wave of refugees was succeeded by a second significant migration from Vietnam, commencing in 1978 and continuing until the mid-1980s. According to the Immigration Policy Center, this mass movement involved nearly 2 million individuals. These individuals were commonly referred to as boat people because they escaped Vietnam by way of overcrowded vessels. This was a very risky endeavor, as, quote, many Vietnamese refugees were lost at sea or fell victim to pirates, end quote. And why would they embark on such a treacherous journey? These refugees sought escape from the communist re-education camps and the 1979 Chinese invasion of Vietnam, which put many of their lives and livelihoods at stake. Most of the refugees went to the, quote, neighboring southeastern countries of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Hong Kong, end quote. However, such large numbers of refugees forced these countries of first asylum to expel them. So, according to the Immigration Policy Center, in 1979, the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, France, and Canada agreed to be the countries of resettlement for these Vietnamese refugees. To facilitate the resettlement of Vietnamese refugees, according to Texas Tech University's Vietnam Center, the U.S. government worked with the Vietnamese government and United States High Commissioner for Refugees to form a program called the Orderly Departure Program, or ODP, which aimed to stop the departures by overpowered boats and settle Vietnamese refugees to the United States. The ODP had 3 categories in which Vietnamese could qualify for immigration to the U.S. family reunification, former U.S. employee, and former re-education camp detainee. By the end of the program on September 30th, 1994, the ODP allowed 167,000 Vietnamese former detainees and 523,000 Vietnamese refugees, immigrants, and parolees to come to the United States. Most settled where a Vietnamese presence already existed, such as the states of California, Texas, and Washington. The third wave of immigration began after the boat people, and it was the last major wave of immigration. These immigrants entered throughout the late 1980s and 1990s and consisted of less refugees and more family members of American citizens as well as political prisoners, according to the Migration Policy Institute. These immigrants were pulled into America by the possibility of family reunification. They were often granted visas as immediate relatives of U.S. citizens and through family sponsorships. A critical piece of immigration law was the Marriage Homecoming Act, enacted by Congress in 1987. This act permitted the immigration of Vietnamese children with American fathers to the U.S. This legislation facilitated the immigration of an estimated 23,000 to 25,000 Amerasians and 60,000 to 70,000 of their relatives to the U.S., according to the Texas Tech University's Vietnam Center. This wave of immigration has largely ceased in the 1990s, as according to the Immigration Policy Institute, 75% of Vietnamese immigrants arrived in the United States before 2000. Another interesting statistic details the shift of migration reasons. Quote, nearly all Vietnamese immigrants, 99%, who received a green card in 1982 were refugees. In contrast, just 2% of Vietnamese immigrants getting a green card in 2012 have been refugees, while 96% did so as a result of family ties. For the most part, more recent arrivals are family members of early refugees and Amerasians from Vietnam, end quote. Now, we were talking about the perceived Vietnamese immigrant privilege. Vietnamese immigrants have experienced more favorable immigrant legislation compared to other Asian or general immigrant groups. The first wave of Vietnamese immigrants consisted mainly of U.S. collaborators following the Vietnam War, prompting the U.S. government to assist in their settlement. Subsequent waves of Vietnamese immigration were also the direct result of the Vietnam War. Consequently, the U.S. felt compelled to permit the immigration of Vietnamese refugees, leading to the government legislation supporting Vietnamese immigration. However, this does not mean that Vietnamese Americans did not experience hardships. According to the Immigration Policy Center, when the first wave of Vietnamese immigrants came to America, only 36% of Americans favored Vietnamese immigration. Additionally, most Vietnamese refugees who came to America during the second wave did not have a complete education, lacked job experience, and usable economic assets. According to the Immigration Policy Center, many had very limited knowledge of the English language, and all of these factors made integrating into American society all the more challenging for Vietnamese immigrants. Despite this, Vietnamese immigrants have shown some of the best entrepreneurial spirit in establishing a living for themselves and their families. Perhaps spurred on by the language barrier preventing them from obtaining well-paying jobs, Vietnamese migrants established many small businesses. According to the National Congress of Vietnamese Americans, quote, businesses owned by Vietnamese Americans employed 97,035 people, had an annual payroll of $1.1 billion, and generated annual receipts of $9.3 billion in 2003, end quote. Perhaps the market most impacted by Vietnamese entrepreneurship is a nail salon. Vietnamese Americans make up, quote, 43% of licensed technicians nationwide and dominate 80% of the industry in California, end quote. Vietnamese immigrants as a whole tend to be one of the most staunchly anti-communist groups among Asian Americans, and due to their experiences in Vietnam, now many of them flee to America. This connects with Vietnamese activism on human rights and refugee policy, where Vietnamese Americans protest for expanded immigration for refugees, especially from Southeastern Asia. An example of this type of activism is a Viet Rise activist group who protest and speak out against policies that they deem are harmful to the Vietnamese community. Now I'm going to go into Vietnamese American stereotypes and contributions to American society. Vietnamese Americans experience stereotypes in American society, two of which I will dive into. The first is the model minority stereotype, a stereotype often applied to all Asian Americans in the U.S. that declares them to be smart, competent, and hardworking. However, this stereotype also has a negative side, pointed out by Jennifer Lee, a professor of sociology at Columbia University. Quote, but Asian Americans are also vilified for being too smart, too focused on athletics, one-dimensional, and lacking personal skills, end quote. This stereotype, like all others, ignores the variation in Asian American culture and socioeconomic status. Furthermore, Asians are often said to be all the same, with no perceivable difference between two groups, for example, say a Vietnamese American and a Filipino American. The next is the stereotype associating Vietnamese Americans with the Vietnam War. Many Americans' knowledge of Vietnam is limited to the Vietnam War and thus have a poor perception of Vietnamese Americans as a result of the brutality of the conflict. Some contributions to American culture is the cuisine that Vietnamese Americans brought to America. I will wager that you have eaten pho and have seen Vietnamese restaurants in your area. The Vietnamese influence in both the nail salon and shrimp industry is immense, with both industries propped up by Vietnamese involvement and ownership. Now I will go into the story of immigration. Andrew Lam was part of the first wave of Vietnamese immigrants. He and his family left Saigon 2 days before the communist forces captured the city. Quote, my family and I were airlifted on a C-130 cargo plane 2 hours before the Viet Cong shells bombarded the runway, end quote. His father was an officer in the Vietnamese government. South Vietnamese government. So Andrew Lam and his family were able to escape to the U.S. After spending 3 weeks in Guam and a week in Southern California in refugee camps, his family was sponsored by his mom's sister and left the camp to live in San Francisco. Quote, in school, kids always asked whether I had killed anybody in Vietnam or had seen dead bodies and helicopters being blown up, end quote. Andrew Lam's story exemplifies the story of Vietnamese immigration to the U.S. His father was a collaborator with the U.S. government in the Vietnam War and thus was evacuated to the U.S. His family was also sponsored by a family member living in the U.S., much like some of the third wave of Vietnamese immigrants. His experiences in American schools detail one stereotype put on Vietnamese Americans, that they're all connected to the Vietnam War. Now, my personal reflection. The resilience of the people desperate to stop and escape brutality never ceases to amaze me. And in particular, the case of Vietnam immigrants are no exception. The second wave of immigrants fleeing the political and military persecution of the Vietnamese government fled in overcrowded boats to neighboring countries, braving weather and pirates to escape tyranny. Their ability to adapt to American society also amazes me, from coming as refugees to having entrepreneurial success. I also connected with the stereotype of the modern minority and the perception that all Asian Americans are, for example, good at math or smart. I hope that this podcast has been both informative and interesting in its rendition of the Vietnamese immigration story. Thank you for listening, and when we are joined again by Jonathan Hill. Until next time.